Good evening. Welcome to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward. Our guests this week are Mary Jane Logan McCallum of Munsee, Delaware Nation, a professor of history at the University of Winnipeg, as well as the author of Indigenous Women, Work and History, among other works, and Adele Perry, a professor of history at the University of Manitoba, the author of Aqueduct, Colonialism, Resources, and the Histories We Remember about Shoal Lake 40, among other works. They are the co-authors of Structures of Indifference, an Indigenous Life and Death in a Canadian City, a book that focuses mainly on the life and death of Brian Sinclair. I would say a book that would be considered timely any time, but perhaps more so as we just recently marked the 10th anniversary of the death of Brian Sinclair. And thank you to you both for taking part in the show here today. Mary Jane, maybe for you first, for those who don't know who Brian Sinclair was, can you tell us a bit about him?
Sure. Well, as a person, I didn't know Brian Sinclair personally. So I largely came to know about Brian Sinclair by reading the transcripts from the inquest into his death. And so reading those inquest records helped to understand a little bit about his history and his family life, as up to the point where he went to the Health Sciences Center 10 years ago. So as a person, I encountered the media story, right, in September of 2008, and was as shocked as anybody else about hearing about a man who had waited in an emergency room for 34 hours and had died there without ever being treated. But it was actually the work that went into this book and the work of the Brian Sinclair Working Group where I came to know him more as a person, as a human being, as opposed to as a media story.
Adele, can you explain to us maybe what happened to Brian Sinclair in the last 34 hours of his life in 2008?
Right. So that was a topic that was both an issue that people responded to right after the moment, and the fact that we're here talking about it 10 years and a little bit later is a testament to the advocacy of Brian Sinclair's family and the Indigenous community in Winnipeg and Manitoba, who found multiple ways to insist that this was a story that needed to be examined, and this was a story that we should not forget and should not be kind of shelved on the very weighty list of topics of difficult histories involving Indigenous peoples in modern Canada that kind of tend to get ignored and we move along from. So the fact that we're here talking about it is a testament to that advocacy. But what happened to Brian Sinclair is that he did, as far as we can tell, everything absolutely how you were supposed to. He had a significant but not life-threatening health concern. He first went to his primary care health providers. He was referred to an emergency room to get a fairly minor kind of medical procedure done that was better done in a sterile circumstances. And he presented himself to the appropriate sort of desk in the emergency room. And we know from the work of the inquest and the histories it unpacked is that he stayed there for 34 hours. He was repeatedly seen by a range of people, including just everyday folks who were in the emergency room because they were there with family or friends, but also in particular by staff. And he was repeatedly seen but not treated. And after 34 hours, he died from an easily treatable condition that could have been treated probably with a change to a catheter and with antibiotics. So this story really stands, I think, as a very crystal clear example of wider patterns of the sort of social conditions, what we call here structures of indifference, that collectively work to kind of deny the full humanity of Indigenous people. And so we see these stories happen in hospitals, and what a nurse leader from British Columbia named Tanya Dick talked about as Brian Sinclair's stories in the plural. And there she's referring not simply to his story as an individual one, but the extent to which Indigenous peoples, not just in Winnipeg or Manitoba, but across Canada, have experiences, in particular of hospitals, that speak to these issues. But in the book, we also connect these to other circumstances that collectively work to kind of devalue Indigenous life. And over the last year, when we've been writing this book, there's been a number of these that have kind of put those questions to the fore, and those include, the death of Tina Fontaine, the death of Colton Boushie, the current inquest that's going on not too far away from here into the circumstances around the death of a man named Errol Green who died in the Winnipeg Remand Center. And we see both the circumstances of those people's lives, but also the kind of flawed responses to them as being revealing circumstances that tell us a lot about the past and the present that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people live in.
Much of the structure of Indifference that you focus on in this book is healthcare, but you write that the assumption that hospital staff had that he was either intoxicated or homeless or that he was just sleeping. But it wasn't just the health sector that misrepresented Brian Sinclair and as you put in the book, robbed him of his humanity, was it? The media also kind of had this narrative that wasn't true in terms of him being a homeless person.
Yeah, what we find is that these structures of indifference are pervasive throughout, our society, and that they impact all people. And so, there were several forms of misrecognition that occurred in this case. So, Brian Sinclair was misrecognized as a homeless individual in the ER room as not needing care, as somebody who was a frequent flyer, somebody who went to the hospital quite frequently, somebody who wasn't there to receive care, even though there was, perpetually throughout those 34 hours, signals that he did. Mm-hmm. So he vomited twice. Housekeeping was called both times to clean up. He was given a basin. And there are, there's the security cameras in the ER that filmed him over those 34 hours, track this decline, right, where he sort of slumps further and further into his chair while he's his body is being poisoned, right? His blood pressure is dropping and all of his organs are shutting down. So there's all of these signals plus the signal that he's in an ER in the first place, that he needs help. And yet there are these kind of measures of normalizing, him not needing help, I guess, or not requiring a medical assistance.
There was an inquest into Brian's death that started in 2013, provided more than 60 recommendations, but there was something in that inquest that family and many felt was left out. Adele, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so I would say this book that we've written here is both written through and kind of against the inquest, in the sense that we very much depend on the records the inquest has generated, the interviews that were done, the facts that were gathered. But at the same time, we are also joining the Brian Sinclair Working Group and members of the family and other who have called attention to, in particular, the issues that were left off the table, especially in the second stage of the inquest.
Yeah, so there were basically two stages of the inquest. And in the first stage, the judge seemed quite willing to discuss all kinds of different issues that came into play to help to understand why Brian Sinclair died and to help come up with measures to prevent that happening in the future. So that's the kind of purpose of an inquest in the beginning. So, for example, racism was something that was talked about, misrepresentations, assumptions made about social class and poverty, as well as ability and gender. But in the second phase, the judge narrowed the scope of questioning. And so at that point, racism kind of came off the table as a possible factor influencing his death. And at that point, the Aboriginal organizations who were involved in the inquest sort of stepped back and thought about what they wanted to do. So Gani Ganijik, which is a service organization in the city, said, we're stepping out of this. Mm-hmm. Aboriginal Legal Services stepped out. They didn't see that this was anymore a case that was in their domain, because it became less about Aboriginal people and more about procedures that were going on in the hospital. So, and the family and the Assembly Manitoba Chief stayed on board so that they could make a comment at the end, but they didn't participate in the kind of testimony. So.
And as you write in the book, what happened was that everybody was trying to portray it as a one-off or a perfect storm anyway to divert attention from the issues of racism and colonialism. We do have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guests this week are Mary Jane Logan McCallum and Adele Perry, the authors of Structures of Indifference and Indigenous Life and Death in a Canadian City. And we were talking about the inquest before we went to break, but Mary Jane, you were part of and how they kind of diverted away from colonialism and racism at the inquest and with the recommendations. You were on the Brian Sinclair working group, and the first sentence in that interim report was Brian Sinclair was killed by racism. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the Brian Sinclair Working Group was a group of individuals who did research on racism in healthcare and the legal system. There was a few lawyers from Aboriginal Legal Services, Emily Hill in particular, Barry LaValle, who is the head of the Center for Aboriginal Health Education here at the University of Manitoba, and a physician. There was a librarian. There was a vast, diverse group of people that kind of came together to insist that racism stay on the table, at least in our conversations about the case. So where it had come off the table in the inquest, we wanted to keep it at front and center. So one of the things that we did was we met quite frequently to talk about the case and our approaches to it, and we kind of came together to write this interim report, and we did a release of that report last year alongside a guest lecture by Shireen Razik, who's a sociologist and a historian of kind of race and racism. And her lecture was amazing. We had this launch. Afterwards, there was a discussion that, a lot of these issues are still, prevalent in the healthcare system. We had a number of people who work in the system who said, we still don't have mechanisms to advocate for Aboriginal people to track racism in the system. And that really kind of motivated me to kind of think about another way to keep this again in the minds of people, to continue the work of the Brian Sinclair's family. And at that point, I wanted to do something for the 10-year anniversary of his death, and turned to Adele and asked for some help. And over the course of basically a year, we produced this very small volume to talk about really the historical context, and to kind of put this case into the history of both the city of Winnipeg, but also the healthcare system generally.
And as we mentioned, we did recently just mark the 10-year anniversary. And I guess during your research and all of that, do you feel 10 years on that Indigenous people feel safe going to a hospital, or feel they're going to be treated fairly and adequately?
I think one thing about 10 years is that this was a history that we were all part of, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it was 10 years ago, that's a while ago, but I walked these streets 10 years ago, and so did Dr. McCallum, and so did you. And so in the sense, these are histories that are with us still. They weren't created instantaneously. The conditions of colonialism and dispossession, and the conditions that have often worked to create contexts where Indigenous people are vulnerable within urban spaces, including within the one that Brian Sinclair found himself, were ones that were developed over centuries, and they're ones that will take a long time to dismantle. And so I would say these are histories that didn't just kind of come into being instantaneously 10 years ago, and they're ones that we're very much still a part of. So one of the things we say at the end of the book, and this is something that I come back to a lot, is that we write about, we're historians, we're interested in the past. It's all very nerdy. It's all the stuff that happened a long time ago. But we do so in the present, right? Like, we write about things for people that are alive now. We teach in classrooms to students who are here. And so our work is always in dialogue with the past and the present. And this is very much the recent past. But it is a recent past that we're still a part of, but that we think can only really be understood when we think historically. Because otherwise, this story should not make a lot of sense. And it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because this story of this person who by all accounts did all the right things, who by all accounts had like the exact sort of situation that you should lead yourself to a hospital emergency ward, all of that, and yet was repeatedly left in circumstances that ultimately led to his death, it should not make sense. And it only makes sense when we situate it at the juncture of a bunch of histories that have made hospitals in particular and urban spaces ones where people repeatedly, not just once or twice, but people who repeatedly saw Brian Sinclair in one way or another assumed that his presence in the hospital emergency room was not legitimate. And what were those histories that made this person, who was a middle-aged person, who was in a situation where he was within a couple of kilometers, where he lived most of his life, where he was absolutely in his own territories as an Anishinaabe person? What makes it this circumstances where so many people, or certainly quite a few people, can look at him and think for one reason or other he's not really supposed to be here. He must be here for some other reason, whether it's to watch TV, whether it's to get warm, even though it's September and it's 21 degrees out, it's not cold. And even though he wasn't homeless, even though he had places where he went, he volunteered, he had places in his community where he had, friends and people to go and chat with. He was not looking for somewhere to do that. But what is it that all of these explanations that all kind of get back to this idea that his presence there is somehow illegitimate? And I think it's only really history that we can use to explain that. But the history isn't over, right? Like, it's history we're all living through today, and we were 10 years ago.
Well, and as nerdy as you might think it is, I really enjoyed the part of the book where it went back of the history and how, some of these communities and sites where we are today came to be, and I found that very interesting. As we mentioned, Winnipeg plays a major role in this this book that you've authored, and almost 10 years later, Winnipeg was famously referred to as one of the most racist cities in the country, if not the most racist city in Canada. And so many years removed from Brian Sinclair's death, what does that say to you?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting way of framing. At the time, I referred to it as this kind of terrible racist Olympics, right?
Yeah,
like as if
exactly.
we're in this kind of contest. Colonialism and racism are critical to Canada, and they are critical to Canadian cities. They are across the country. They are articulated and lived in different ways, and I think one of the histories that we're trying to kind of get at this book is histories of racism within Canada and within Winnipeg, but also the histories of this city as a remarkable Indigenous place, and a place where Indigenous people have lived in great numbers and have found ways to kind of claim the city. And so I think, the kind of that sort of thinking that informed the Maclean's headline and that we all kind of carry around with us still is not a terribly helpful way of either approaching racism and colonialism in Canada as a whole, or in Winnipeg in particular. But there is so much to talk about the wealth of Indigenous history of this city and this place.
One of the ways that we did that was to think about the place where Brian died. The chapter on healthcare kind of looks at the ER. The ER is located in the Anne Thomas Callahan building. That building was named after an Indigenous nurse, one of the first to be trained at here at the Winnipeg General Hospital, and who worked here from the 50s to the 70s, and then had a full career in nursing education and cultural safety training and that kind of thing. So, and is a respected elder today. So, that this has a history that goes back to the 50s, but it goes back much beyond that too. So we look at the kind of the streets around the hospital itself, McDermott, McBannaton, that these are connected to fur trade families, and that the hospital itself is connected to the transfer of land, but also is connected to Indigenous labor throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, like as a continuous history.
Sorry, I got to hold you there as we step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guests this week are Mary Jane Logan McCallum and Adele Perry, the authors of Structures of Indifference and Indigenous Life and Death in a Canadian City. And in the conclusion of the book, you make reference to the deaths of Tina Fontaine and Colton Bushy, and the acquittals of Raymond Cormier and Gerald Stanley, and the connection to other settler institutions, which we briefly touched on earlier. But I'm wondering if you can talk about that connection and the death of Brian Sinclair.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very hard to live through that year. I think for those of us who care about these kinds of issues, it was a very difficult year. It was I guess difficult because there was a lot of discussion of racism, and there was a lot of denial of racism all at the same time. So it seemed like racism was kind of the topic for all kinds of people all at once, and it was just really difficult to kind of live through that time. So it was very hard to kind of think through Brian Sinclair outside of that context, and outside of this context whereby we have these histories of colonialism and racism and racial segregation in our systems that we're inheriting, and that we see the end result of that over and over and over again, whereby these deaths of individuals get kind of normalized and then kind of condoned by the state. It sort of becomes something that's natural and something that we expect almost.
And we can also see how in particular around the discussion of both Tina Fontaine and Colton Boushie, the way that there was kind of this attention to the minutiae of their behavior or their kind of humanity, that in some sense has come back to this idea that is very much present in the discussion around Brian Sinclair, that it was something about him that caused his death. And so Shireen Razak, who we mentioned earlier, talks about when studying Indigenous deaths in custody, how there's this overwhelming discursive construction of the death as always already happening already. And so it's not ultimately the fact that somebody murdered this individual or that they met their death and such, that it's something kind of about something they have done or who they are or their behavior that has somehow inevitably produced their own death. And so in that sense, I think we can see all of those as being kind of structures that both create conditions which can persistently dehumanize Indigenous people and devalue their lives and their death. And this year, this difficult year for Indigenous people and for, non-Indigenous people who, like myself, who care about our Indigenous colleagues and friends and communities, was an incredibly difficult one, I think partially because it came following, the release of the TRC report to a great deal of meaningful engagement and popular response. The winter of Idle No More, the way that Indigenous politics and issues of Indigenous peoples kind of shaped a federal election. Like at this moment where it seemed like there was a bit of the earth was sort of tilting on its axis and these conversations were happening in a kind of a meaningful and a genuine way. And then following that, we have this spate of incidents that kind of remind us about the way the world we live in still works in ways that, as it very much did with around Mr. Sinclair, devalues Indigenous people's lives.
Well, it's an incredible read, Structures of Indifference. My thanks to you both for taking some time to be with us here on Face to Face. You can find more, including podcasts, at aptn.ca/face-to-face podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. I'm Dennis Ward.